This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we'll be joined by Graeme MacQueen and Richard Gage, AIA. They're going to be talking about some of the seismic evidence surrounding the World Trade Center destructions, pointing to the fact that these buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions. This is going to be a lively discussion. It's a long one, so I'm going to play that for you in just a moment.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth.
My first guest today is Graeme MacQueen. He's a retired professor of religious studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where he taught from 1974 to 2003. He was also the founder and former director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University. In 2009, he wrote a paper titled, "Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground?" We'll be talking about that today. Graeme, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Great to be here, Andy. Thank you.
And my other guest certainly needs no introduction to this audience. He's Richard Gage, AIA, a San Francisco Bay Area architect of 28 years, a member of the American Institute of Architects, and the founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. During his architectural career, Richard Gage has worked on most types of building construction, including numerous fireproof steel frame buildings. He's done a lot for the movement, been all over the world talking about the evidence, giving presentations. He'll be talking about incorporating the seismic evidence into the presentations now. So, Richard, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you, Andy. Great to be here with you and Graeme.
All right, so to get started, we're going to actually start with you, Richard. Why did you decide to look at the seismic evidence and consider adding it to the canon of evidence after all of this time?
Well, we have been avoiding it, frankly, for years and years because it is a sticky wicket. And there has been conflicting interpretations and conclusions by different members of the 9/11 Truth movement. And after Andre Rousseau came out as late as 2012 with his startling, detailed, and exhaustive scholarly work on the analysis from an applied geophysicist perspective, it kind of pulled us into the orbit of the seismic evidence, and we decided to set some interpretations aside and pick up what we call the consensus, what David Ray Griffin and the consensus panel, the 9/11 consensus panel, brought it in as the best evidence, that is to say, the combination of Andre Rousseau's article in 2012 and Graham's article in 2009, and also Furlong and Ross back in 2006, present a pretty compelling series of conclusions that suggest that the seismic signals picked up at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory by the Columbia University from the Palisades, New York station, there are 4 seismic events, as we'll talk about, and they suggest in their report that these events are associated with the 2 plane impacts and the 2 collapses by the Twin Towers, as well as the 3rd collapse by World Trade Center 7. And the evidence suggests otherwise, that it wasn't the impacts of the planes or the collapses of these buildings that created those seismic signals. It was something that occurred before those very varying events. So it's a fascinating topic, and I finally put my head deep into it, and I'm glad that I finally did. I mean, it takes days and days and days of research to kind of get into this enough to understand what seismic signals are, how they propagate, and what they mean. It's the subject of people a lot smarter than me. But thank God they're out there, and they've written what they've written, and it's been very helpful to the movement.
Yes, it has. Every bit of research done, every bit of digging. You've mentioned a bunch of names. We'll be going over some of what people like Andre Rousseau have put forward a little bit later. I remember I interviewed Andre Rousseau probably in the first year of 9/11 freefall. So we've visited upon this before, but we've not visited it again ever since, not for any particular reason other than AE has not really delved into this until now. But there have been people delving into this in the past, and Graeme MacQueen is one of them. So, Graeme, we're just going to go back into your motivation. What motivated you to write your 2009 paper?
Well, I guess I really didn't start getting into the 9/11 skeptic movement till about 2005 somewhere. And from that point on, I was hooked, and I was spending pretty much all day, every day, doing research and reading and occasionally writing on this issue. And one of the things that kept coming up, especially I think because I spent so much time with the eyewitness reports, was this shaking of the earth. I mean, the earth really, really shook, okay, when those Twin Towers came down. And by that I mean people said stuff like, I was in an earthquake when I was a kid, and it was exactly like that. And not only did the earth shake, but there was a tremendous noise, usually described either as a rumble or as a roar, when these buildings came down. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It doesn't sound like a gravity-driven collapse after airplane hits. It sounds to me like it probably supports the controlled demolition hypothesis more. But let's look into it. Now, I was hesitant, to be honest. It took me a while. I waited because I thought, who am I? You know, a guy with background in humanities and social sciences. You know, I'm not a physicist. I'm not a seismologist, certainly, not an engineer. So I kind of waited for quite a while, even though I thought the evidence was pretty clear, because I thought at some point somebody with the proper qualifications will come waltzing in and do the job. And, of course, they didn't. Most of the people with the relevant expertise were either hiding under their desk, you know, or running in the other direction or whatever. And so finally I thought, what am I really worried about here? I'm not going to, I won't write an article that has a lot of seismology in it. All I need to do is do some careful measurements, which I should be able to do. I know how to do that. And do a little bit of basic arithmetic, you know, adding and subtracting. And I think things will become clear. So that's what I did. Essentially, if we want to figure out why those buildings came down the way they did, one of the things we need to figure out is when they came down, and what, you know, when the earth shake, which we know happened, when it happened, and what caused it. And so I started with fairly simple, basic questions like, can we know when the collapse, and I decided to focus on the South Tower in this article. So can we really figure out when that South Tower started to come down? And because there's no point people saying, oh, it took such and such a time for the building collapse. That's meaningless unless you can tell us what you mean by the start and what you mean by the end. So I defined that. This is what I mean by the beginning. This is what I mean by the end. I used video evidence to try and figure out in quite a bit of detail when the South Tower began to come down, when the debris hit the ground, and how long an interval there was between them. And after doing that, I used basically three types of evidence. The seismic report that Richard mentioned from the LDEO Observatory, and I didn't do any exotic interpretation of it, but, you know, the basic facts are there. And then I used the evidence from video cameras The towers were, of course, videotaped as they came down, and some of the cameras shook quite violently. NIST didn't look at that evidence, but it's actually very important. And then the third type of evidence was eyewitness evidence, which NIST also didn't look at. For listeners, by NIST I mean National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I'm almost done here, but let me, since I'm on a roll, if you don't mind, Andy, I'll give the main thing I tried to do. Can I do that?
Absolutely.
All right. So basically, NIST says there's nothing mysterious about why the Earth shook. These buildings were hit by planes, they got structurally weakened, and then they fell down, or rather they collapsed. And NIST doesn't want us to consider too deeply, why they turned into powder in midair. But anyway, these great waves of powder and dust hit the ground, bam, and that's why the Earth shook. So to support that hypothesis, which is the gravity collapse hypothesis, NIST has to come up with certain times. They have to be able to show that the debris didn't hit the ground until a certain number of times after the collapse, a certain number of seconds after the collapse began. And I show very easily that that's false, that they're wrong. They're playing with figures, they're lying, they're distorting, and they're not looking at evidence that they don't want to look at, and it's fairly easy. So that's what I do. I show in the article that they're wrong. The Earth began shaking long before the debris hit the ground, and in fact, there was some shaking of the Earth before there was even any visible sign of collapse at all. Several seconds before the towers came down, people started to feel the Earth shake. And so I just say, whatever the truth may be, it's definitely not what NIST is telling us. And therefore their attempt to support their gravity collapse hypothesis is clearly false.
Well, absolutely, as we point out so often here on the show from so many different angles, at the very least it justifies a new investigation. How much did NIST get into the seismic evidence when they did their reports? What did the federal government do when they investigated this aspect, or did they at all?
Well, they were certainly forced to deal with the reality, the cold, hard fact that, and let's go all the way back to the plane impacts to answer this question, which is an hour and a half or so before these buildings came down. So the planes hit the towers, in the case of the North Tower, at 8:46 and 40 seconds in the morning. The problem is, and that's according to the radar, ground-based radar, which is accurate to the second. And everybody then argues about, when the planes hit the towers. But the reality is, as measured at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, is that it's 14 seconds before that the seismic signals are received. And I don't mean to confuse the issue by received. It's 34 kilometers or 20 miles away in Palisades, but they calculate due to the propagation speed of these surface waves when they originated. And they originated 14 seconds before the ground-based radar stopped. So NIST does all kinds of shenanigans, such as saying that we don't use the ground-based radar. We use our observations of TV network stations, and so they gained 5 seconds with that, and then they actually go back to Columbia University, Professor Kim, and say, hey, in a privately contracted agreement, they pay the university to add 3 more seconds. In other words, move the historical, factual data, the seismic signal, 3 seconds. And they give some rationalization for that, but that report is never produced publicly. So they try to decrease this gap in reality through these manipulations. But they're still short, no matter, even with all of their manipulations, they're short at least 3 seconds. So that leaves the question, what caused these signals, and it's actually 6 to 10 seconds prior to the plane impacts. And the evidence is very clear. As Graeme looked at the pre-collapse explosions, but there's also evidence of pre-impact explosions. And one of the most well-known examples is William Rodriguez, who was on the B1 level, just below ground, felt an explosion, heard an explosion, felt it pushing him up. And then people come up from down below in the basement and say, explosion, explosion. And there's this, the parking structure's highly damaged, the entire press, the shop is damaged, the 50-ton hydraulic press is completely destroyed. There's the explosions come up the elevators and blow into the lobby. And there's 14 witnesses who were with him on that B1 level who heard this, and 20 other witnesses in levels below that experienced, and people who were badly injured by these explosions. And then he hears way up above him an explosion, which is the impact of the airplane. And he says several seconds later. But if we go to an actual meeting that was recorded around the corner from the World Trade Center, they actually recorded the first explosion and then 9 seconds later, the impact of the airplane. And that's the famous Ginny Carr audio recording. So it substantiates the pre-plane impact explosions. In addition, there's the analysis from Andre Rousseau in 2012 that shows why those signals could not have been created by the airplanes, but must have been created by actual explosions.
Yeah, just in case our listeners are confused. So I agree with what Richard's saying, but I only looked at one set of NIST's fraud in my article, namely the question of what happened when the buildings came down. Richard's talking about two frauds. He's talking about the one where the building came down, but also the earlier one when the planes struck the buildings. And I agree with that, but I just didn't look at that material in this particular article. So we're really saying that for NIST to support the standard of the official narrative of 9/11, they have to make certain claims about two different sets of seismic evidence. First is what they say is the plane striking the building, and that's what Richard was talking about there. And the second is, the debris supposedly striking the ground. And what we're saying is that we have very serious doubts about their interpretations of both of those sets of evidence.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's been overlooked from that day. Obviously, the NIST reports are fraudulent. That we've outlined that so many times here on this show. But yeah, you guys are talking about two different aspects of it, but they still take into account the seismic data, which again we're looking at now not for the first time ever, but we're presenting it for the first time. Now, Graeme, in your paper, you write, in its 2005 report, NIST glosses over a serious difficulty. It says, and this is from the NIST report, times listed in Table 3.1 for the collapses of the two towers based on the television records and the revised LDEO. The LDEO is Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Their analysis appear to differ significantly. These differences are likely due to different definitions used for the collapse times. The times based on visual analysis refer to the time when the collapse of a tower first became evident, while the times based on seismic records, quote, likely indicate the time when the falling debris first struck the ground. Now, I'm asking you, why is this term important, the term likely?
Oh, well, it seemed to me, I'm not sure what the right word is for it. Niels Harrit calls terms like that academic terrorism. I mean, basically, it's, what are they saying, likely? I mean, why don't they ask the people at LDEO what they meant? Why don't they ask FEMA what they meant? Then they wouldn't have to say, this is likely what's going on. As I point out in the article, NIST was given the authority to subpoena witnesses. They can ask anybody they want, right, in the U.S. I think what likely acknowledges there is that they know they're in trouble. And they know they're in trouble partly because, and they never come out and say this directly. You have to actually look at the evidence. Their interpretation of the seismic data is completely different from FEMA's. Remember that FEMA and the American Society of Civil Engineers came out with their very preliminary analysis of the collapse of the towers some years before NIST. You know, it was very early, and it's very rough. It's not a particularly good report, but they do have an interpretation of the seismic signal from the South Tower, and that is that it began at the beginning of the collapse and continued until the end of the collapse. Now, that is completely different from NIST. NIST said, no, it begins at the end of the collapse when the debris hits the ground. And NIST obviously likes that hypothesis because it supports the gravity-driven one. If they accept FEMA, then they've got to explain why on earth a building would be shaking the ground everywhere so badly when it's coming down that they're going to pick it up at the Earth Observatory 34 kilometers away? Excuse me, that's not going to happen. So they basically, FEMA and NIST have completely different interpretations of what caused the seismic signal. And NIST, in that passage that you quoted, is trying to gloss over that instead of just telling us, look, we disagree, and now let's try and figure out who's right.
Right, and they're using unscientific, unsure words like likely rather than getting it down. I mean, again, this is one of the worst attacks on our soil in history. It seems like you go that extra mile to narrow down. Richard, I'm going to have you, because I'm looking at your PowerPoint presentation here, and you've got a lot of great points. I'm going to ask you just to kind of briefly go over some of the points that you have been making during our webinars and be making in future presentations when you deliver this evidence.
Yes, because what I was just astounded by is the multi-angled approach that Andre Rousseau, the applied geophysicist who's written 50 published papers on the mechanics of waves in solids, i.e. the Earth. He looks at this so many different ways. For instance, going back to the plane impacts, planes, he cites when they hit the ground, they produce a very high frequency of seismic impulses on the order of 10 hertz to 100 hertz. Now, earthquakes and explosions don't do that. They produce seismic impulses on the order of 1 hertz. So it makes no sense that the airplane's impacts could have been associated at all with these particular seismic signals. It's an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude off. So that was pretty clear, and I'm blown away by it. In addition to that, by the way, with seismographs filter out frequencies they're not interested in, and they focus on low frequencies, like 0.6 to 5 hertz. That gives you the earthquakes, the earth movements, and avoids these other extraneous signals that they don't want. So they actually filter out any kind of an aircraft impact that would produce 10 to 100 hertz signals, frequencies. So that right there is just kind of dead-on evidence. Getting back to the actual building collapses, the reason those can't possibly be the result of the seismic signals associated with them by NIST and by LDEO, Andre Rousseau says that those signals, they can't either be, well, let me take a step back here. When the buildings collapse, the debris begins hitting the ground about 10 seconds after the building starts to collapse. What you have is 4-ton and 8-ton structural steel sections that are ejected laterally at 60 miles an hour. We document this in the rest of our evidence, landing 600 feet in every direction. Well, they're scattered geographically and over time across a huge area well outside the boundary of the World Trade Center site itself, and they're landing substantially on a 7-story parking structure, which is further mitigating the seismic effects of that falling debris. The building doesn't fall all at once. In fact, the steel is distributed over this incredible area. The concrete, which there's 90,000 tons of concrete, 100,000 tons of steel. The concrete, as we cited in our presentations, is pulverized to a fine powder in midair. It's not available to produce any seismic signals whatsoever. So you have more than 2/3 of the weight of this building that's not even available to produce signals. What's left? File cabinets and gypsum board, which is also pulverized. It's simply not available to do the work that it's said to have been done. And, of course, as Graeme has highlighted, the timing is off. So it doesn't make sense. That was one of the compelling reasons that got me into this as well. It's not just that, hey, the timing is different, It's all of these other reasons that Professor Rousseau came up with.
Now, there's also an important witness role for video cameras on tripods. I'm going to let Graeme talk about that because I know you document it in your paper. As you mentioned, again, there's video camera footage that actually shakes before the South Tower comes down. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I just wanted to say, though, that I agree with Richard about the importance of Rousseau's paper. And Rousseau is an expert, and Rousseau, as Richard says there's no way that these signals were caused either by the planes hitting the buildings or by the debris hitting the ground. There's no way that 34 kilometers away this would be registered in the way that we actually see. And that's why we have to look at explosions. To get back to video cameras, I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to do a detailed analysis of what seismic waves and all that. We'll let people like Rousseau do that, and I'm really glad he came forward and did that. But in the meantime, there are a couple of things that I think I can help with, and these are forms of evidence that NIST didn't want to look at for some reason. The first is the video cameras shaking, and there's more than one. So they're filming the Twin Towers, and at a certain point you can tell the camera is shaking. And you can actually plot the shaking, which is what I did with one TV station, New York 1. I downloaded the clip and took 1,700 separate measurements in order to create a graph on Excel showing visually the shaking of the camera. And it's quite useful because we then can look at timestamps. We can figure out when it started shaking, when it ended, when the biggest spikes were. And for now, I'll just say perhaps the single most important thing, well, no, two things. First is FEMA was right. The building is definitely, the ground is shaking in that vicinity quite violently the whole time the building is coming down. Yes, it shakes when the debris hits the ground because, of course, it's very close to the building, but it shakes the whole time it's coming down. And what's more important, perhaps more interesting, is that there is a brief but violent jiggle of the camera about 3 or 4 seconds before there's any visible sign of collapse. And NIST has no explanation for that. We get that with the South Tower, we get that with the North Tower, and as NIST even admits, we get a seismic signal 10 seconds before World Trade 7 starts to come down. So we have evidence of a violent shake of the earth in all 3 of those buildings before there's any visible sign of collapse. So what I tried to use the video evidence pretty carefully in my article, because I was sure there'd be people raising objections, and I thought, well, we'll try and be careful and use more than one form of evidence. We'll look at a couple of different cameras, see how they shake, see when they shake, get a timestamp, figure all that, and then see if we can corroborate it by looking at the eyewitness evidence, which I had. So I don't know. I reread the article this morning. I thought, that's not bad. I don't think there's anything I'd change there.
No, and there's an exchange between news anchor Pat Kiernan and on-the-ground reporter Kirsten Shaughnessy, I believe it's pronounced, during the broadcast of the video collapse. Why is this significant?
Well, it's fascinating because it's you've got one guy who's got a camera pointed up at the South Tower, and by the way, I did go to New York City after that and figured out where that camera, it's not that difficult to figure out where that camera was situated. That's after the article was published, I did that. And then you've got the reporter in a phone booth somewhere, and she can't see the camera at all. But while we're watching, the South Tower start to unravel, she says independently, looking directly at the tower, something like, I don't have her words in front of me here, but, oh my God, it's starting to come down. She says, it's exploding. It's billowing. I got to run. And she takes off, and that's the last we hear of her on that occasion. And it's just very interesting to have those 2 different forms. We have the camera, which she cannot see, and then we've got her as an independent witness, and we've got them both witnessing to the same thing at the same time.
These were some very tall buildings, obviously, but you can still do some comparisons, even with smaller, controlled demolitions. And the answer, Richard, might be no. I don't know. But have there ever been any comparisons with acknowledged controlled demolitions? The seismic signals that we picked up at the Twin Towers and what we picked up from acknowledged controlled demolitions to see if there is any kind of similarities or differences between the two?
What Andre Rousseau says is most controlled demolitions have what he calls subaerial explosions. In other words, they're well off the ground. So they're generally not picked up by seismic stations, particularly those that are 20 miles away. There are mining operations in the New York area that use ammonium nitrate explosions in the ground. Those are picked up as about 2.0 or whatever earthquakes in general. In fact, those occurred on the day of 9/11, and they were picked up. What's very interesting about this, and I don't know why, but if ground-based explosions, like, for instance, the one in World Trade Center 1, the North Tower, prior to the planes impacting the buildings that Rodriguez and others, so many others, experienced, that was picked up. It was coupled to the ground. It was down in the basement in a concrete structure. And less so, by the way, for World Trade Center 2. The pre-impact explosions there were picked up, but they weren't as strong, which is very interesting. But what was not picked up, and why we don't know the answer, is the 1993 bombing which was also in the World Trade Center parking structure, a huge half-ton ammonium nitrate bomb. That should have been picked up, and I'm just suggesting that most seismologists that I've talked to, and there's been a couple, 3, 4 now, whom have actually signed our petition calling for a new investigation, they suggest that it should have been picked up, that there's no reason it shouldn't have. We also have a question about why, if we have two nearly identical collapses in World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2, that, and we show them side by side. I mean, in certain views, you can't tell the difference between them. They both begin suddenly. They both have an extreme outward expulsion of structural steel material trailed by thick white smoke clouds. They both take about 15 seconds to reach the ground, the debris. 10 seconds to begin reaching the ground, and then 15 seconds to complete reaching the ground. And yet, the seismic signals are very different. That makes no sense if what NIST is suggesting is true, that these seismic signals are based on the debris hitting the ground. In World Trade Center 2, we have a 2.1 magnitude on the Richter scale. In World Trade Center 1, we have a 2.3. Those sound very similar, but on this logarithmic scale, it's 1.6 times the energy in World Trade Center 1 versus World Trade Center 2. So Andre Rousseau makes a big point that nearly identical collapses should have yielded nearly identical energy magnitudes on the seismograph if the debris hitting the ground was the cause of these signals.
Talk about eyewitness testimony from the oral histories. How important is that? How much does that play into the seismic debate?
Well, it's extraordinary, and I just want to first suggest that this is one of the very early reports that Graeme had completed, having examined, but I'll just introduce it for him and he can pick it up. He examined the actual oral histories of the first responders that were recorded in the month and months following 9/11. Thomas von Eschen commissioned the recording of these 500 FDNY first responders before their individual memories became shaped by a collective memory. And so here we have 500 first responders. We didn't know about this until the 2005 in August, when the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city of New York to release this information. And it's fascinating. Graeme, can you tell us what you found when you analyzed these transcripts of these oral recordings?
Sure. So I went through that material probably starting in late 2005 and then finishing early in 2006, and published the article in the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And, I came up with 118 members of the FDNY, Fire Department of New York, who witnessed explosions right before or at the beginning of the so-called collapses of the Twin Towers. And I used a pretty rigorous methodology, so I guess people can go and find the article if they want to. It's called 118 Witnesses. But in other words, I wasn't so sloppy as to just say, well, somebody said he heard a big sound, so we'll count that as an explosion. No. They had to use specific terms like explosion and so on. Anyway, so that was a big finding for me, at least. I was surprised that the evidence was so overwhelming. And I'll just add to that when I did this later article that was published in 2009, and of course I did the research a year before that, so it's actually, I did the research 10 years ago, 2008. I thought, I know that those oral histories pretty well, so let me see if I can mine that same mine for more information that's directly relevant to this article about the earth shaking. So if readers go and look at that article, which is called, it's also in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, called Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground? Is that the title? I think it is. What I did at the end in an appendix, and also in the body of the article to some extent, is give more eyewitness testimony, not the same as the 118 witnesses. It's new, and it directly has to do with people perceiving the ground shaking. And when did they perceive that? And so you might have somebody who said, I felt the earth shake. I could actually see objects bouncing up and down on the highway, and I thought, what the hell is this? I looked up at the South Tower, and I thought, oh my God, it's going to come down. And in some cases, they make it really clear that they actually felt the shaking before they saw any visible sign of collapse. Then the building comes down. And this is important because one of them says the ground was shaking like a trampoline. This was tremendous shaking of the earth, and it began, according to some of these eyewitnesses, before any visible sign of collapse. So this is the same material Richard's talking about. This is the oral histories of the Fire Department of New York. I also added another body of material, which is the reports from the Port Authority Police Department, which were also released. And so you have police officers saying similar things.
Now, I'm going to ask you both to comment on this, but Graeme writes in his paper, and I'm going to read it verbatim. In 2006, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which had produced a lengthy report in 2005 on the demise of the Twin Towers, attempted to answer a number of questions about the collapses. Here are two of the questions and answers as found in this 2006 publication. Why were two distinct spikes, one for each tower, seen in seismic records before the towers collapsed? Isn't this indicative of explosion occurring in each tower? The seismic spikes for the collapse of the WTC towers are the result of debris from the collapsing towers impacting the ground. The spikes began approximately 10 seconds after the times for the start of each building's collapse and continued for approximately 15 seconds. There were no seismic signals that occurred prior to the initiation of the collapse of either tower. The seismic record contains no evidence that would indicate explosions occurring prior to the collapse of the towers. Now, I know we spent a long time here going over why that's not true, but I want to get a reaction from you to that statement. We're going to start with Graeme.
Well, yeah, it's false. And I guess you could say the whole article that I wrote has the purpose of showing that that's false. It's interesting that NIST felt forced to answer the question, because the question seems to have come from dissenters like us who asked, why were these seismic spikes seen before the towers collapsed? Somebody is raising questions, and NIST wants to put all that to bed. So it's very clear here. The seismic spikes are the result of debris from the collapsing towers. The spikes began 10 seconds after the times for the start of each building's collapse. That's false. They're affirming their hypothesis, but they're doing it with evidence that we can show as false.
Richard, what's your comment?
It's nowhere more evident than their suggestion at World Trade Center 7, which has a signal associated near the time of its collapse, a seismic signal, as well. In fact, the seismic signal begins, let's see, at 5:20 p.m. in the afternoon in 40 seconds. That's when it begins. But the building doesn't collapse, according to NIST, for another 12 seconds after the seismic signal. So they couldn't manipulate this one by going back to LDO and say, hey, can you move that seismic signal forward in time so that we can associate it with the time of the collapse of Building 7?
Exactly.
And they couldn't do that in this case for some, I don't know why, but like they did in the Twin Towers pre-impact signals. So they actually have an explanation for this in NIST NC Star 1-7, Appendix B. Here's what they say. A seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of collapse of Building 7 was likely due to the falling of debris from inside the building, is what they mean, during the collapse, because according to them, the collapse is actually taking more than 30 seconds from beginning to end. Now, this goes back to their theory of collapse, which says, hey, the whole building collapsed inside of itself first, without any indication. 30 seconds before the building collapses, there's no indication that there's any collapse going on. And yet they found a few pixels in the screen that moved. And so they based their entire theory on what we go through in detail in our course on this subject for architects called 9/11 and the Architect's Guide, Part 1, the World Trade Center 7. So the theory quickly involves the fires on floors 12 and 13, which expand long-span beams, pushing a girder off of its seat on column 79, and then there's this collapse that happens vertically inside the building around column 79, and thus they're saying that's responsible for the collapse of the east penthouse approximately 6 seconds before the overall collapse of this building. But then they've got themselves wound up in trying to show how this vertical collapse around on the east side travels across this building in just a few seconds, all the way across this football-length building, inside the building, but not exposing any exterior deformation of the structural steel perimeter system or the breaking up of granite panels which would ensue and the massive breaking up of windows. None of that happens in the videos. So it's an entire fabrication that these signals 10 seconds prior to the collapse could have been caused by an interior collapse, because we would have seen the results of that. So it makes no sense. Graeme, I think you had a comment too.
Oh, I'm glad you brought it up, Richard. To me, that NIST analysis of what happened at World Trade 7 is, if you don't mind me saying, is symbolic of what the war on terror is all about, really. It's anti-science. They're saying, there were hidden things that you guys, you ordinary civilians, can't possibly see with your senses. Hidden things were happening. Inside the World Trade Center, World Trade 7, the whole building had come down. There was just a shell left. You're too stupid to see that, but we know that. And when we ask them, well, did you see it? They say, well, we didn't actually see it, no. And so it's positing hidden causes. It's almost as if somebody said, this building came down because, the Jolly Green Giant knocked it down, but the Jolly Green Giant is invisible. And so, you're just going to have to accept our view on that. I just think, I'm exasperated because I think as citizens we're being treated as children here. We're being told to trust things that go against our senses where there's no actual evidence that's been provided. We're just supposed to have faith. That's not good enough for me.
No, it's not good enough for me either. I've seen many examples of that. I've even heard in an interview Shyam Sunder describing the metal falling from the South Tower as being silver when it's very clear that it's orange. So right there, a guy's telling me that what I'm seeing, I can't trust my own eyes there.
Right.
I can't see the actual color of it. Well, right there, I don't trust this person anymore. There's so many examples of that. I could spend the next hour going over them, but we know we've been lied to. Every year, AE 9/11 Truth chips away at the official story, goes over it with a big red pen, leaving NIST with really nothing other than the mark of officialdom to protect them from any kind of real scrutiny on this issue. But we're closing in. We've got some actions that we're doing. We'll hopefully get the Bobby McIlvaine Act passed and have a real investigation and address all of these matters that you guys are bringing up here today. Everything else, I appreciate you guys taking the effort to, first of all, bring this evidence to everybody, and also for Richard to incorporate it into presentations from now on. Richard, before we run out of time today, you did this a little bit earlier, but just to sort of bring it home, if people are interested in the seismic evidence aspect of this issue, you mentioned Andre Rousseau. Can you tell us the name of that paper again, and also what are the other papers and authors that they need to be finding?
Yeah, you bet. I think the best way to get introduced to this complex material is through the introductory point in the best evidence produced by the Consensus 9/11 panel. That's the inspiration of David Ray Griffin, who's taken the best evidence that this team of objective researchers in the 9/11 truth movement have achieved consensus upon, and their point TT-7, and I think you could just Google that, point TT-7, 9/11 consensus. It's called Why Did the Twin Towers Collapse? The Seismic Evidence, which is a very neat summary of the work from 2006 of Furlong and Ross on this subject, and the work of Andre Rousseau, 2012, and I believe they also have a draw on Graeme MacQueen's 2009 article, which is indeed called Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground? So we have just produced we are producing a bulletin on this subject called it's a FAQ. So it's FAQ number, I forget the number, what it's going to be, but does the seismic evidence show that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition? And in that FAQ, we primarily point our readers to the consensus panel, which introduces this subject. But then for those who are extraordinarily motivated, we do suggest that they look at Andre Rousseau's 2012 paper called Were Explosives the Source of the Seismic Signal Emitted from New York on September 11th, 2001? So that's Andre Rousseau, Rousseau. And then, of course, we refer people to Graeme MacQueen's work, Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground, 2009. Furlong and Ross, Craig Furlong and Gordon Ross, in 2006, Seismic Proof, 9/11 was an inside job. Of course, they make that conclusion based on evidence that they suggest it was extremely unlikely, like on the order of 1 to a billion, that hijackers or foreign agents could have somehow achieved the necessary inside access. So that's why they use that terminology. Now, it's of note that early in this work, Jim Hoffman, in 2006, did produce an article, Seismic Records of the Twin Towers Destruction, in which he, at that time, found corroboration of the official story relative to the seismic events. So since then, I think, in my opinion, Hoffman's work has been superseded. But we put it out there as a reference because it's notable, and it should be in the overall body of research articles. And then, of course, the original articles should be looked at from Lamont Doherty, Earth Observatory, Columbia University, 2001, Seismic Waves Generated by Aircraft Impacts and Building Collapses at World Trade Center, New York City. Their conclusion is right in the title of the article, in case anyone had any confusion. So we have seismologists on our petition directly refuting these seismologists who have apparent grievous conflicts of interest.
Could I just add one thing? The three main articles that Richard mentioned, Rousseau, Furlong and Ross, and MacQueen, are all published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which is an online journal which people can find.
Absolutely, and that is very helpful, and I encourage everybody to go out there, read up, find out as much as you can about this, as much as you have about this issue in general. You can also watch it during our webinars on Thursdays. So, again, you're going to be hearing a lot more about this starting tonight with this show. Richard Gage, Graeme MacQueen, I want to thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you, Andy.
Well,
thanks, great.
Great to be with both of you. Thank you.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week. Good luck.